The record was wrong. Archivist Velsorin noticed it the way you notice a crack in a wall you've walked past 1,000 times, not because it had changed, but because something in the light had shifted and suddenly you could see what had always been there. The entry in the Conclave's expulsion registry was dated 14 cycles ago, routine in its language, bureaucratic in its precision. Humanity, probationary status revoked, coordinates quarantined, contact prohibited under Statute 7 of the Foundational Accords. But the entry had been asterisk amended asterisk. Someone had added a single line in a secondary notation field that almost no one ever checked. Observation suspended by mutual agreement. Mutual, that word did not belong in an expulsion record. Expulsions were not mutual, they were sentences. Velsorin set down the data read and looked out through the archive's crystalline wall at the great curved belly of the Conclave station, at 1,000 ships drifting in their assigned lanes, at the ordered, rational machinery of galactic civilization, operating exactly as designed. Then he looked back at the word. Mutual. The expulsion of humanity from the galactic conclave had been, by almost every institutional measure, a success. That was the official position. That was what the record said. 14 cycles ago, following what the conclave's investigative body had formally classified as the Varrows incident, a catastrophic breakdown of human diplomatic behavior that had resulted in the destruction of a mediation vessel, the contamination of a neutral station's atmospheric processors with something the human delegation had apparently introduced deliberately and what 3 separate alien witnesses described as a human diplomat laughing during the emergency evacuation. The conclave had voted, in extraordinary session, to suspend humanity's provisional membership and quarantine the Sol system from all registered trade routes. The vote had passed with unprecedented unanimity, 41 member species, 41 votes in favor. The human representative had not contested it. That was the first thing Velsorin had never been able to explain. He had read the transcript of the session 17 times over the years, not because it was his assignment. He was a junior archivist. Humanity's quarantine file was nobody's active assignment anymore, but because the human representative's final recorded statement had never made sense to him, and things that didn't make sense had a way of lodging in his mind like splinters. The human representative, a woman named Commander Adafer, had stood before 41 species and said simply, "We understand. We'll see you in 14 years. Not we'll appeal, not we protest asterisk, not even this is unjust. We'll see you in 14 years." No one had asked what she meant. The session had ended. The quarantine had gone into effect. And for 14 cycles, 14 years by human reckoning, the Sol system had existed as a gray zone on galactic charts, present but unreachable, acknowledged but ignored. Humanity had become a footnote, a cautionary tale told to new species joining the conclave as evidence that provisional membership could be revoked. The conclave had moved on. Velsorin pulled up the secondary file. The amendment notation had no author tag, which was itself a violation of archival protocol. Every change required attribution. It had been inserted cleanly into the record approximately 3 cycles ago, almost halfway through humanity's quarantine period, and it had sat there unnoticed ever since, buried under 11 layers of routine administrative cross-referencing. Observation suspended by mutual agreement. Who had agreed? Agreed to what? Suspended observation implied there had been observation, which meant someone in the conclave had been watching the Sol system or had tried to watch it and had then stopped. Not because the humans had gone quiet, because something had been arranged . He reached for the access log to see who had last opened this file before him. The log showed a single access entry from 3 years prior. The access code belonged to High Arbiter Marandas, the most senior judicial authority in the conclave, A being who had no reason, none whatsoever, to be reading a routine expulsion record for a quarantined species that hadn't been anyone's problem in over a decade. Velsorin sat very still for a long moment. Then he did something a junior archivist had absolutely no authority to do. He flagged the file for immediate review and sent a priority notation to the Arbiter's chamber. He was fairly certain he was about to lose his position. He sent it anyway. The response came in 4 hours, which was remarkable. High Arbiter Marandas did not typically respond to junior archivists. The Arbiter did not typically respond to anyone in under 4 days. The message contained exactly 11 words. Come to my chamber, bring the original record, tell no one. High Arbiter Marandas was old by any species standard. She was Selhari, a people whose natural lifespan ran to nearly 3 centuries, and she looked every year of it. Her surface scales dulled from their original amber to something approaching gray, her movement deliberate in the way of a being that had learned to conserve what it had. She was standing at her chamber window when Velsorin arrived, looking out at the same view he'd seen from the archive, except from 40 levels higher. She didn't turn when he entered. You found the notation, she said. Yes, High Arbiter. I imagine you have questions. I have, he paused, recalibrated. I don't know where to begin. She turned then, and her expression, Selhari faces were not built for the range of emotion that some species displayed. But they were readable if you knew how to look, carried something Velsorin had never expected to see on the face of the Conclave's most senior judicial authority. It looked like fear. 14 cycles ago, she said, we made a decision that we believed was correct, proportionate, legally sound. She moved to her desk slowly and sat. We were wrong about what we had done. We were wrong about what it would cause, and we were wrong about what humanity would become during those 14 cycles. What did they become? She looked at him for a long moment. That, she said, is what the Conclave is about to discover. Their self-imposed quarantine ended 6 standard days ago. The first human vessel crossed back into registered galactic space at 400 station time. Velsorin felt something cold settle into his chest. 1 vessel. No, Marandas said. That was simply the first one we detected. The Varrows incident, as Velsorin had understood it, as everyone understood it, had been a straightforward case of human instability manifesting in a diplomatic context. The humans had been new to the Conclave provisional members for only 3 cycles, and they had been difficult throughout. Unpredictable in negotiation, prone to emotional responses in what were meant to be purely analytical discussions, and disturbingly comfortable with ambiguity in situations that required precise agreement. The mediation at Varrows Station had concerned a territorial boundary dispute between the Heth Collective and the Orani Commonwealth, a disagreement that had simmered for 60 years and required only a formal framework to resolve. Humans had been invited as neutral observers, a gesture of inclusion meant to integrate them into Conclave process. It should have been simple. It had been, by any rational metric, the worst possible outcome. The human delegation had introduced what the investigation later classified as a biochemical contaminant into Varrows Station's shared atmospheric system on the 2nd day of mediation. The contaminant had caused mild hallucinogenic effects in approximately 40% of the station's population. The mediation had collapsed. The Heth lead negotiator had suffered what the medical report described as a significant dissociative episode. The human diplomat, not Adafer, but one of her team, a young man named Specialist Tors, had been observed in the corridor outside the mediation chamber, not evacuating, not assisting, but apparently singing while the station's emergency systems engaged. The formal investigation had concluded: deliberate sabotage, reckless endangerment, conduct incompatible with Conclave membership. The conclusion had been unanimous. The logic had been airtight. Only none of it, as Velsorin was now beginning to understand, had been accurately interpreted. "The contaminant," he said slowly, looking at the secondary documentation Marandas had laid before him. Documents he'd never had clearance to access, documents the public record had never referenced, wasn't theirs. No. Someone else introduced it. A third party with an interest in the mediation failing. We established this internally, approximately 2 cycles after the expulsion. She said it with a flatness that was more devastating than anger. The human delegation had, in fact, detected the contaminant's early dispersal signature before anyone else on the station. They had been attempting to identify the source and develop a counteragent. The materials found in their quarters, which the investigation characterized as evidence of sabotage, were the components of a filtration system they were constructing. The room was very quiet. "They were trying to fix it," Velsorin said. "Yes." "And Specialist Tours in the corridor was experiencing the contaminant's hallucinogenic effects himself. The singing was a documented human coping behavior. He had been exposed trying to reach the atmospheric control junction. The medical data was in the record. No one checked it against his behavior." She paused. "No one thought to. Why wasn't the expulsion reversed?" Here, for the first time, Marandas looked away. "Because by the time we had established what had actually occurred, the political cost of revering a unanimous conclave decision, publicly admitting that 41 species had expelled an innocent party based on a misread investigation, was deemed too significant. There were parties with interests in maintaining the quarantine. And there was—" She stopped. "There was what?" She returned her gaze to him. "There was a belief, held by many in the senior council, that even if the incident had been misattributed, the underlying judgment was correct. That humanity was simply too unpredictable for membership. That the expulsion was, in effect, correct for the wrong reasons. That they would be safer, we would all be safer with the quarantine in place." Velsorin thought about Adafer standing before 41 species at the conclusion of her civilization's trial, and saying, "We'll see you in 14 years. He understood it differently now. She hadn't been making a vague, emotional statement. She hadn't been protesting or pleading. She had been making an asterisk declaration of intent with absolute precision, in the calm voice of someone who already knew exactly what was going to happen next and had decided, consciously, to let it. The question was what she had known. "The 14 years," he said. "That's specific. Why 14? Why not appeal immediately or after 1 cycle or 5? Marandas said nothing. She slid a third document across the desk, an intercept log, a fragment of a communication that had apparently been flagged by monitoring systems and then quietly buried. It was a transmission sent from the Sol system interior, approximately 3 cycles after the expulsion. It was addressed to no one in particular, broadcast on an open frequency that no active conclave monitoring system watched, because the system was quarantined and no one was officially listening. The transmission was short. It appeared to be a routine engineering update of some kind, full of technical notation that had been logged as low-priority background noise. But someone had pulled it from the archive and run it through a deeper translation matrix, and that analysis was appended to the bottom of the document. The technical notation, parsed correctly, was not an engineering update. It was a schedule, a countdown, item by item, of something being built, something that had been started not after the expulsion, not in response to it, but before, years before. A project that the humans had apparently begun during their first cycle of conclave provisional membership, quietly, without announcement, structured around a 14-cycle completion timeline, as if the quarantine period had been anticipated and incorporated into the plan before the expulsion had ever occurred. "They knew," Velsorin said. "They knew they were going to be expelled." "We don't know that. They built around it. We don't know what they built." He looked up, but that's why the observation was suspended. Someone tried to find out and couldn't, or could asterisk, and the agreement was made to stop. The High Arbiter's expression was, again, that thing he didn't want to name. The observation team sent to the edge of the quarantine zone in the third cycle of the expulsion period reported that the Sol system was showing unusual energy signatures consistent with large-scale manufacturing. In the fifth cycle, a deeper probe was dispatched. It returned damaged, not destroyed, *damaged*, with its recording systems wiped. Wiped by whom? By the humans. They sent a representative, a small vessel barely crewed. It intercepted the probe, returned it to us intact, and transmitted a message. She paused. The message said, "We see you watching, we understand why. You may continue if you need to, but we thought you should know that we see you, and we wanted to ask officially that you wait. We will come back when we're ready. We would like the chance to do this correctly this time. Please." The word "please" sitting in the middle of that transmission, hit Velsorin somewhere he hadn't expected. And the Conclave agreed. The senior council voted to suspend active monitoring. Yes, the notation was recorded in the file. The vote was never publicized. She folded her hands on the desk. The decision was made based on a secondary factor that I have not yet mentioned. She pushed one final document across the table, a medical report from the observation team that had made contact with the human vessel at the quarantine boundary. Velsorin read it, then he read it again. The human crew of the intercepting vessel had been assessed during the brief contact period by the probe's automated bioscan systems. Standard procedure. The scan results had been attached to the probe's report and quietly added to the file. The humans were different, measurably, physiologically different from the baseline data recorded during their provisional membership period, not in ways consistent with a 14-cycle passage of time. In ways consistent with deliberate biological adaptation, increased stress hormone regulation, denser neural pathway development in the prefrontal regions associated with long-term strategic thinking, measurable changes in the chemical markers associated with what human science called fear response. The humans in that vessel were, by every biological metric, more resilient than any human the Conclave had ever recorded contact with. And the youngest member of that crew, according to the bioscan's age estimation protocols, was 11 years old. "They're raising children," Velsorin said, "inside the quarantine, with these adaptations already present." "The children were born after the expulsion," Marandas confirmed. "They have never known anything except the quarantine. They have been prepared from birth for whatever it is the humans intend to do when they returned." "What do they intend?" The High Arbiter stood slowly and moved back to the window. Outside, on the main approach lane to Conclave Station Prime, a new signal had appeared on the traffic array. Then another. Then 6 more. Then, in the space of the next 40 seconds, 23 additional contacts, emerging from non-standard approach vectors, from directions that the station's traffic management system didn't have active monitoring coverage for, directions that would have required extensive prior mapping of the station's sensor blind spots to navigate precisely. Mapping that would have had to begin years ago. "They intend," Marandas said, "to stand before the Conclave and ask for judgment." The human fleet, and calling it a fleet felt both accurate and insufficient, because the word fleet implied a military formation, and this was something stranger, arrived at Conclave Station Prime in a configuration that the Traffic Control Authority later described, in their incident report, as deliberately non-threatening in a way that was somehow more alarming than a threatening formation would have been. The ships were not warships. They were not the cramped, technically adequate vessels that humanity had operated during their provisional membership period. They were large, significantly larger, and they had clearly been built with attention to longevity rather than speed, designed for sustained deep space operation rather than short-range diplomacy. They moved in a loose arrangement that respected Conclave traffic protocols precisely, each vessel broadcasting identification codes and requesting formal docking permissions through the correct channels, following every procedural requirement down to the standard communication delay intervals. But there were 37 of them. Traffic controller Usanara had been on shift when the contacts began appearing, and later, in the debrief that her supervisor would describe as the most detail-dense incident report I have read in 22 years of station management, she recorded her experience of those 40 seconds with a precision that suggested the memory had burned itself permanently into her recall. The first contact appeared on standard approach, identification broadcasting, no anomalies, she wrote. I initiated standard greeting protocol. The vessel acknowledged correct format, correct codes, perfect standard galactic pronunciation from what sounded like a very young female voice. She identified herself as Navigator Osai of the human vessel Patience *. She said, and I have replicated this from the recording exactly, she said, Traffic control, this is Patience *, requesting docking assignment and formal conclave admittance. We have an appointment. We are a little early. We apologize if this is inconvenient. A little early. 6 days after their quarantine expired, 37 vessels arriving from pre-mapped sensor blind spots, and they apologized for being a little early. The second contact appeared 14 seconds after the first. I thought it was a sensor echo, Usanara wrote. Then the third appeared. By the time I had the seventh contact on my board, I had already triggered the senior alert. By the time the senior controller reached my station, I had 23. She had asked, through the open communication channel that was still connected to the human vessel Patience *, a question that she admitted in her report she had not thought through before asking. I said, how many of you are there? The young female voice, Navigator Osai, 11 or 12 years old by human reckoning, born inside the quarantine, never having seen a space station before this moment, had answered without hesitation. Enough, she said, but we're not here for that. Then what are you here for? A brief pause, not hesitation, the pause of someone choosing words carefully. We're here for the trial that didn't happen correctly the first time. Commander Adafer requests a formal audience with the full conclave, all 41 species. Another pause. We're also bringing evidence. It's going to take a little while to present all of it. We hope you'll be patient. The communication had then, politely, placed itself on hold, while the human vessel * Patience completed its docking approach with flawless precision, parking in berth 17 as if its navigator had memorized the station's layout years ago. Which, Velsorin realized, reading Usanara's report in Marindas's chamber while the arrival was still unfolding outside, was almost certainly exactly what had happened. The evidence had been 14 years in the preparation. This was the thing that the Conclave's emergency session, convened within 6 hours of the human fleet's arrival, every senior member present either in person or by remote link, the chamber packed in a way Velsorin had never seen in his 8 years of service, struggled most severely to absorb. Not the evidence itself, though the evidence was extraordinary. Not the sheer organizational scale of what humanity had apparently accomplished inside a quarantine system with no external trade access and no recognized galactic standing. Not even the fact that they'd arrived with 37 ships designed for long-range sustained operation, which implied they had somewhere to go and intended to go there. What paralyzed the chamber in those first hours was the simple temporal reality of it. Everything the humans were presenting had been prepared before the expulsion was final. The legal documentation, the counter-investigation, the forensic reconstruction of the Varrows incident's actual sequence of events. It had been assembled, according to the file timestamps, beginning approximately 8 months into humanity's provisional membership period, a year and a half before Varrows. "You started preparing for this before Varrows happened," said Arbiter Silvas, who was chairing the emergency session with visible discomfort and even more visible disbelief. He was Orani, one of the species that had been directly involved in the Varrows mediation, and his voice carried a tension that was not quite accusation and not quite awe. "You were preparing a legal defense before there was anything to defend." Commander Adiz Adafer stood in the center of the chamber's presentation floor. She was older than the image in her membership files, of course she was, 14 years older, but the difference was not merely time. The woman in the files had been confident. The woman standing in the chamber was something quieter and more settled than confident. She looked like someone who had been waiting for a very long time and was no longer in a hurry because the waiting was finished. "We were preparing for an eventuality," she said. "Not Varrows specifically. We didn't know what form it would take." "Then what did you know?" She considered the question with a seriousness that the chamber seemed to feel physically. "We knew that we were different from every species in this conclave in ways that we hadn't fully explained to anyone. We knew that difference would be misread. We knew that something would happen, some event, some incident that would look, from the outside, like evidence that we were dangerous, when the reality was more complicated." She paused. "We made a decision as a species not to fight the expulsion when it came. Because fighting it immediately would have meant arguing our case from a position of weakness, in a forum that didn't trust us yet, with evidence we hadn't had time to make airtight. So you chose to accept exile," Silvas said, and the disbelief in his voice was so raw it almost sounded like something else. "Chose to use the time correctly." Her voice was even. "We knew you'd be watching eventually. We sent the please wait message because we meant it. We weren't building a threat. We were building what we should have had when we first arrived." She looked around the chamber at 41 species, at the same faces that had voted unanimously to cast her civilization out of galactic society, and her expression held nothing vindictive, nothing triumphant, something more unsettling than either. "We were building the ability to have this conversation as equals." The chamber was quiet in the specific way that large spaces go quiet when everyone in them is thinking very hard. "You anticipated," said a delegate from the Heth Collective, one of the other species directly damaged by the Varrows incident, "that you would be exiled. You built your return into the quarantine period. You prepared your children for it. And then you waited." "Yes." "For 14 years. "Yes." The Heth delegate, whose name was Suthara, and who had a reputation in the conclave for an almost mechanical dispassion, said something that wasn't in any procedural format Velsorin had ever heard in a conclave session. "Why?" Suthara said. "Not on what grounds do you contest the expulsion asterisk, not what remedy are you seeking. Just, why? The question of someone trying to understand something that was operating on a logic they couldn't fully follow." Adafer looked at her. "Because you mattered," she said. All of this, the conclave, the relationships, the membership, it mattered to us. Not as a trade agreement, not as a military alliance. Because we're the kind of species that needs to belong to something larger than ourselves. We're built that way all the way down." She touched the edge of the presentation podium with 2 fingers, a small, almost unconscious gesture. "When you expelled us, you didn't just remove our trading rights. You cut us off from the only evidence we'd found that we weren't alone." A pause, barely long enough to register. "We weren't going to throw that away by arguing badly, so we went home and we did the work." Velsorin, seated in the observer gallery at the back of the chamber, found that he had been holding his breath. The evidence itself took 4 sessions to present. The forensic reconstruction of the Varrows incident was thorough enough to be irrefutable and painful enough to watch that 3 separate delegates requested recesses. The actual perpetrators of the atmospheric contamination were identified. A third-party faction with economic interests in the Heth-Orani boundary dispute remaining unresolved. and the documentation of their involvement had apparently been in humanity's possession for approximately 12 years, assembled with a patience and methodical rigor that the Conclave's own investigative body, watching the reconstruction, found extremely difficult not to read as a rebuke of their original work. But the evidence of the Varrows incident, Velsorin began to realize, was not the core of what humanity had brought to this chamber. It was the threshold. It was what needed to be said first, before anything else could be said, to establish the terms of the conversation. What humanity had actually brought, what those 37 ships were carrying, what 14 years of isolated preparation had produced, was something the Conclave had not been expecting and did not yet have adequate language to describe. It was a proposal, not for readmission, not for restored membership rights, not for compensation or apology, though both were offered in the appropriate sections of the documentation. It was a proposal for restructuring the foundational framework of the Galactic Conclave itself. 37 ships, each carrying a different component of the proposal, each crewed by specialists who had spent their entire adult lives studying a single aspect of what was wrong with how the Conclave operated and how it might be fixed, each with documentation prepared in the precise legal format of Conclave procedural law, which human scholars had apparently spent 14 years mastering. "You're not here for vindication," Arbiter Marandas said. She had inserted herself into the session at the end of the third day, invoking her judicial authority to speak outside the formal order of proceedings, which she had the right to do and almost never exercised. "You're here for revision." Adafer looked at her. Something in her expression briefly was not the controlled steadiness she'd maintained through 4 days of sessions. Something older, something that might have been, in a human Velsorin had known less well by this point, relief. "We're here," Adafer said, "because the system that expelled us also expelled 3 other species in the last 40 cycles under similar misreadings. We found all 3 of them. 2 of them are still alive. Their cases are in the documentation." She let that land. "We spent 14 years not just proving what happened to us. We spent 14 years documenting what happens to everyone that this system fails. Because if we came back just to restore our own membership, we'd be doing exactly what this institution expects, looking out for ourselves. And we need you to understand that is not how we work." Suthara, the Heth delegate, spoke again from the floor. "You are saying that you used your exile to build a case not only for yourselves but for other exiled species. 3 cases in the documentation, 2 living, 1 lost." Adafer's voice didn't change register when she said *1 lost, but something in the chamber shifted anyway, a pressure change, an almost subliminal recognition that the word meant what it meant. "We went and found them. We told them what we were doing. We asked if we could carry their cases alongside ours. And they agreed. One of the living species is represented on this station right now. They came with us. They're waiting." She looked at Seal Voss. "We'd like to request that they be heard." The chamber didn't erupt exactly, but the quality of its silence changed into something with more weight. Velsorin was watching Marandas. The High Arbiter was watching Adafer with an expression he finally had a name for. It was not fear, exactly, or not only fear. It was the expression of someone who had understood, in theory, that they had made a serious error, and was now standing in the full material reality of what the correction of that error actually looked like, and discovering that it was simultaneously more hopeful and more frightening than the error had been. "How?" Silvas said. He meant it as a legal question. How had the humans located other exiled species? How had they negotiated representation rights? How had they structured the proposal documents? But it came out as something rower. How does a species do this? How do you go into exile and come back carrying other people's cases alongside your own? Adafer understood what he was actually asking. "We're built for it," she said quietly. "We've never been able to stop. That's the thing you misread about us every time." Her hand moved again to the edge of the podium, that small anchoring gesture. It wasn't the contamination that scared you at Varrows. It wasn't the instability or the emotion or the unpredictability. It was the fact that when everything was going wrong, we still tried to fix it. You saw Tors singing in the corridor and you read chaos. A pause. He was singing because it was the only thing keeping him functional while he was trying to reach the environmental control system. He was afraid. He does that when he's afraid. He kept moving anyway. She looked around the chamber one final time. We do that, she said, all of us. We keep moving anyway. You can read that however you want, but if you want to understand us, if you actually want to know what you're dealing with, that's it. That's all of it. We don't stop. Not because we're strong, because stopping doesn't feel like an option we can choose. The formal vote on humanity's readmission took 11 days. It passed. 40 species in favor, 1 abstention, no votes against. The abstention was formally logged without comment by the delegate who cast it, though Velsorin, reading the session record afterward, noted that the same delegate had voted yes on all 3 ancillary resolutions admitting the human proposal for procedural reform to the Conclave's standing review framework. The 2 surviving exiled species whose cases humanity had carried were granted formal hearings. The cases were complex. The hearings took months. 1 species was ultimately readmitted. The other's situation was more complicated. The errors involved older and more entrenched, and the process of addressing them was still ongoing when Velsorin, 3 cycles later, was promoted from junior archivist to senior archivist and inherited the file in his new official capacity. Specialist Tors, who had been singing in a corridor on Varrows station, while a hallucinogenic contaminant burned through his system, and he tried to reach an environmental control junction he never quite made it to, was given a formal acknowledgement in the session record. Not an apology. The Conclave's legal structure didn't allow for formal apologies in the way human culture might have expected. But his name appeared in the final summary of the Varrows reinvestigation, alongside the corrected account of what had occurred, and the record noted that his actions had been consistent with attempting to protect others under conditions of significant personal impairment. He was 41 years old by then, and he was aboard one of the 37 ships. Velsorin learned this from Adafer during one of the informal briefings she gave to Conclave staff in the months following the formal proceedings, sessions that had initially been met with wariness and had gradually filled until people were standing in the corridor outside. What does he do now? Velsorin asked her during one of these sessions. He wasn't sure why he'd asked about Tors specifically. Something about the image of it, the singing, the fear, the corridor, the moving anyway had never left him. Adafer considered this. He works in atmospheric systems, she said. Has since we went back. He's extraordinary at it. Spent 14 years engineering environmental control solutions for the quarantine period. A brief pause and something in her expression that was not quite a smile but was close to one. He figured if that was what got us expelled, he should probably be very good at it. Velsorin thought about that for a long time afterward. He thought about it when he read the final procedural amendment that the Conclave adopted, 18 months after the readmission, implementing the first of the human proposal's structural recommendations. A mandatory secondary investigation period before any expulsion vote could be finalized. A cooling window built specifically to prevent the kind of rushed consensus that had produced the Varrows decision. He thought about it when the second exiled species case was finally resolved, 4 cycles after humanity's return, their readmission approved by a vote that would never have been possible without the framework humans had built. He thought about it when he reopened the expulsion registry and found now an entry that had been amended again. Not in a hidden notation field, not by an unnamed editor, but officially at the top of the record, in the primary summary field where it would be seen by every archivist and administrator who ever pulled the file for any reason. The amendment read, Expulsion determination reversed. Basis invalidated. See associated reform directive. And then below that in the standard field for outcome notation, matter resolved by return of subject species. Subject species returned voluntarily, on schedule, with documentation of others similarly affected. Subject species returned carrying more than their own case. Velsorin sat with that sentence for a while. The archive was quiet around him. Outside the crystalline wall, the approach lanes to Conclave Station Prime were active with traffic, more traffic than they'd carried before humanity's return, because 3 of the 37 human ships had established themselves as long-range courier vessels operating on routes that hadn't been commercially viable before, connecting systems that had been too far from major trade arteries to serve efficiently. Routes that, he had noticed quietly, passed through or near the dead zones where exiled species territories had been quarantined. Humanity, it appeared, was not finished with the cases that weren't yet resolved. He didn't know if that was reassuring or if it was something more complicated than reassurance. He suspected it was the second thing. He suspected it would remain the second thing, for a very long time, for everyone in the Conclave who had to sit with the full weight of what 14 years of exile had produced. Not bitterness, not retaliation, not even simple vindication, but this. A civilization that had been cut off from everything and had spent every moment of that exile becoming more capable of caring for others than it had been when it arrived. They were not the most powerful species in the Conclave. They were not the oldest or the most technologically advanced or the most diplomatically experienced. They had made errors during their provisional membership, errors separate from Varrows, genuine ones, and they would make more. And they knew it and said so openly in their proposal documents, which was itself one of the things that had taken the chamber longest to process. But they were the species that had been expelled from galactic civilization, and had used the expulsion to build a case for everyone else. The same system had failed. They were the species where a young woman named Navigator Osai, 11 years old, born inside a quarantine, having never seen a space station before in her life, had guided a vessel through sensor-blind spots she'd memorized from charts, and said, "We're a little early. We apologize if this is inconvenient." They were the species where a man who had spent the worst night of his life singing in a corridor, because it was the only thing keeping him functional, had gone home and spent 14 years learning to make atmospheric systems that couldn't fail. The galaxy, Velsorin thought, had expected humanity to be diminished by what it had done to them. It had not anticipated that they would treat diminishment as a set of instructions. He closed the file. He looked out at the traffic lanes, and somewhere in the ordered flow of ships moving through the Conclave's registered space, 37 human vessels moved with them, patient, present, already working on the next thing, as if they had never stopped, as if stopping had never been something they knew how to do, as if 14 years of silence had simply been the time between one breath and the next, and they had spent every second of it waiting to exhale.